Welcome to Fairy Tale Access, where the head fairy's quest is to prove that fairy tales do exist in actual time rather than once upon a time. Together, we will unravel the heroes, young and old, who turn dreams into reality. These are the people who still believe in happily ever after. The discoveries will bend even our most cynical non-believers into believing in fairy tales. Hi, welcome to Fairy Tale Access. Today, we have a historical novel to review with author Rebecca Dwight Bruff. It's called Trouble the Water, and the main character is Robert Smalls. It's definitely an American Odyssey. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Denise Marie. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Okay, I have to know, before we get into parts of the story, I have to know how you found out about Robert Smalls.
Well, you know how sometimes you just discover things that you're not looking for? About 7 years ago, just over 7 years ago, my husband and I visited first North Carolina, then South Carolina. We just had a few days in each state. But we came to Beaufort, which is on the coast, almost exactly between Charleston and Savannah in South Carolina. I'd never been here. It's the heart of the Low Country. I grew up in the panhandle of West Texas, so a completely different look. And we just had a couple of days. And so we took a carriage tour around the historic district, layers and layers of wonderful history here. And as we took that tour, we made a couple of stops along the way. And one of them was in front of a little Baptist church, Tabernacle Baptist Church. And there's a bust standing there of a man whose name I'd never heard. And the carriage driver told us about Robert Smalls, told us that he was born enslaved here in Beaufort in 1839, that he was an extraordinary hero in the Civil War, one of the first black heroes of the Civil War. And so she told us just the tiniest little bit. And then the carriage kept going, and she told us about other people and other things and trees and architecture. And then we rounded a corner and we stopped again in front of a beautiful home. And she told us that that was the house behind which Robert Smalls was born. And that was the introduction to Smalls and his story. He absolutely fascinated me, intrigued me. I couldn't imagine that from what I'd heard, that I'd never heard his name before or anything about his story. And when we got off the carriage tour that day, we went straight to the bookstore to try to find the stories about him. And there weren't very many. And that intrigued me even more. So that's where it began.
How much time did it take you to research the whole story? Because I understand parts of it are fiction where you created his life, but all the highlights in his life that have historical references, how hard was that to obtain?
You know, it was really important to me to stay true to the historical record. And at the same time, I knew that I didn't want to do a biography. There are a couple of nice biographies, but I was really interested in the things that don't show up in the historical record. There are things that are just completely unknown about him. And I'm also curious and interested in the things that motivate people, what relationships are like, those sorts of things. So I determined early on that it would be historical fiction rather than a biography. But I wanted to get the history right. So I read the biographies that I could find. I also found a very thorough account of his legislative life. After the Civil War, Smalls came back to Beaufort and was elected in the state legislature and then U.S. Congress for a time. So I read all of those things. We were still living in Dallas at the time. I read everything I could find those first 3 or 4 years after hearing the story. And then I began making notes about the things that I couldn't find. So those things eventually found themselves being woven together in the story. But lots of research. And, you know, I think research can just go on and on and on. There are so many trails to follow and so many personalities to learn about in the historical record, and so many things that I had to learn about history, about the geography and the climate and the tides and the trees and everything in this new world to me. It was endless.
You did really well with that. The parts that took place on the river were outstanding. The relationships between blacks and whites at the time, and that, like, just wrapping your head around how people think was really astounding. It really made you think about how you would be in that situation. And the diary of the owner. Mm-hmm. That was so well done. So
Thank you.
Up with that part.
Thank you. Well, I think the beauty of fiction is that it does invite us into other people's lives and into their heads and into the ways that they think and the things that they deal with and the world that they live in. And I also think that part of my background in education and theology kind of helps me think about things that way. So that was really valuable. But I wanted on one hand for Smalls to have his own voice. So of course part of the story was written that way. And at the same time, I wanted to sort of enlarge the context of the world that he was living in, from the perspective of sort of the dominant culture. But I didn't want that to carry the story. It's not the story of the dominant culture. And so that's where Mrs. McKee's diary came in. I thought that might be a good place for her to tell us about her world and what she was observing and feeling and thinking and seeing. And, in the lead up to the Civil War, I think it's easy for us to paint things in very broad strokes that, some people thought this and some people thought that. But I think there was a lot of questioning, some, progress on one hand and resistance on the other, and a lot of soul searching among some. And I wanted to have a way to sort of bring some of that to the story.
Definitely. I think you really brought to life how people thought about slavery during that time. I mean, there's the really bad side. And then there's that whole side that is so confused, like the most messed up family that you've ever met, which is really what happened here. Like, they think of them as family, but they also think of him as an object.
Exactly.
And they treat him like a slave. So it's like, what? But
right. Yes, exactly. There's sort of a lingering Southern myth here. And I hear it still occasionally that people will say, well, our ancestors had slaves, but they thought of them as family. Well, maybe they wanted to think of them as family, but owning another person is not love. It's not family. It's, it's awful. And yet that language persists and definitely persisted at the time. I found a wonderful resource, just happenstance, even before we moved here to Beaufort to really dig into the deepest research. And it was a volume called A House Divided. And it was big anthology, big collection of essays and articles and sermons that were written before the Civil War in support of or opposition to slavery. And half the book was justifying, half the book was in opposition. And the arguments, the pro-slavery arguments based on scripture, on economics, on the social science of the day were mind-blowing.
Exactly.
And then the other half of the book was the opposition to that. And it was extraordinary, but it helped me, sort of get into what was happening at the time, what people were thinking and talking about and saying. I also found an extraordinary diary, a journal called The Diary of Mary Chestnut. And Mary Chestnut was the wife of a Civil War officer in D.C. during the Civil War. And she kept a huge diary. I mean, it's very long and it's fascinating to read. And she was really smart and she was extremely observant and very witty. And so that was another sort of glimpse through someone's eyes in the time period to get a sense of that. But, you know, everything that we're experiencing currently in terms of repercussions from that era, in some ways they're senseless, but they make more sense when we can kind of pull back the layers and see what was happening 150, 250 years ago.
No, I have to agree. It is really a current subject.
Very much so.
But the amount of compassion, the fact that Smalls actually met President Lincoln, the forgiveness on his part, and then to buy the house that he lived behind towards the end of his life, that was a little twisted. I couldn't imagine doing that. It'd be the place that I wanted to get away from the fastest.
Right. And at the same time, I suspect, I wish I could have these conversations with him, but I suspect for him, it was a real symbol of overcoming, of coming into his own, of establishing himself as a man and a leader and the head of his family. And, you know, when he came back to Beaufort after the war was over and bought that house, he was still in his late 20s. He was still a young man. And we don't know what his memories were like as a child in the house, but he had moved away. He'd been sent to Charleston when he was 12 or 13. He was gone for 15 or so years. And then he came back and he bought that house from the reward money of turning the planter, the Confederate gunboat, over to the Union Navy. And and he'd been paid well as a Union pilot after that. So I can just imagine the sense of pride and overcoming and establishing himself as a leader in his community when he came back and bought that beautiful home. And he lived the rest of his life there. He raised his family there. He died on that front porch when he was 75 years old.
It's really looks like a beautiful place behind me. So
it is a beautiful place. I go by it as frequently as I can. It's absolutely stunning. It's been maintained very well. It has a historic marker on it. It's privately owned now, but it's a treasure. It absolutely is.
And tell me a little bit about his part in politics during that time.
Well, as I said, he returned to Beaufort after the war. And Beaufort had been, because it was a sea island plantation place, it had become quite wealthy on the backs of the enslaved people, and the white population, the planters, evacuated during the war. Most of the descendants of the enslaved, those who had been enslaved and their descendants, stayed. And so when he returned, it was majority Black, and he was a hero. And, you know, the new state leadership was being formed, and he was elected to the state legislature. And one of the very first things he did, which just still kind of gives me goosebumps, he helped to co-author the first legislation that ensured access to education and to literacy for all the children of South Carolina. And as a child, he'd been prevented from learning to read and write. It was against the law to teach an enslaved person to read or to write. So he came back, he stepped into a role of leadership, and he knew, I think he just knew in his bones, the value of education and how important that was, how liberating that is. And he saw to it right away that would be enacted.
It was so well done. Are these the typical type of stories that you write, historical novels?
Well, I can't really answer that. It's the only one.
It's the only one.
It's the only one so far. My background, as I said, is in education and theology, and I'd written a bit of nonfiction, but I'd never put my hand to fiction before. I love historical fiction as a reader. I didn't know that I liked history until I began reading historical fiction, because it brings people's actual experiences and lives to life. And I think that's the beauty of stories. It helps us to really understand the context of history and not just the dates or places or moments that we see on plaques or buildings. So I love reading historical fiction, but this was a first go at writing it and sharing it.
Wow, it's really well done. And I love the way that you give your references at the end to what was true, what was taken from where and adapted.
Right. I felt like that was really important. I think that's important to the reader. And I love that when I read historical fiction. I like to be able to go to the back of the book afterwards and sort of ask the author, how do you do that? And where did you diverge from the historical record? Or where did you add to it? Or which characters did you invent? So, for example, in this book, I stuck with the McKee family and Robert Smalls and his mother, what we knew of their families. But the antagonist family, the Rhett family, is still a family in this town, in this part of the world. And yet Robert Barnwell Rhett really was the kind of the wild man pushing so hard for secession and leading the charge and insistent upon it. He was a difficult person. He kept a memoir, in fact, because he wanted his biography to be written. And I portrayed him pretty much the way he portrayed himself, but he was a hard person. So I wanted a child of his to grow up alongside Robert Smalls and the McKee's daughter, Liza Beth. I wanted to kind of explore what it was like to grow up in that world. So I gave the Rhetts an additional son. That's where Peter Rhett came from. So he was imagined. Liza Beth's husband was imagined and is a minor character in the story, but we don't know very much about her later life, so I imagine those things. But when I read historical fiction, I love the author's notes. I love to know how they honored the history, which was something I really wanted to do. I really wanted to honor Small's character and his spirit and his legacy, and yet bring depth to that and texture to his life.
You definitely did that. You brought us through that heart-stopping escape where you just couldn't put the book down because you wanted to find out what happened. You wanted to make sure they made it. And you read it with and you realized you were holding your breath. And right. Then there were other parts that just brought that time period really to life. And then you crushed us at so many points. I was crying. I had tissues. I was crying. It was such a well done story. And it was so heartfelt and realistic, where some historical novels go a little bit around the bend. This was really true to Robert Small, the life that he potentially led, the horror of it all, and the mindset of people.
Right.
And you had a really good way. This is one of the best ones that I've written about that period, for the fact that you were able to get us inside those people's heads. Like, what did you think was okay about this?
Thank you. Yeah. I really wanted to be able to get into the perspective that is so hard for us to even comprehend right now, because that was the cultural state at the time. But I wanted to do that in a way didn't let them off the hook or justify, which was pretty challenging. And, the other things that I wanted to, like I said earlier, I really wanted to explore relationships and motivations. And so, for example, when I think about Robert's mother, Lydia, and I wish that I'd been able to find more about her. We know that she was a really strong woman. She was in her mid 40s when she gave birth to him alone behind that house that night. Who does that? She was extraordinarily, right? We don't know who his father is, and we don't know much about who else influenced him, but I'm just convinced that his mother had an enormous influence on his character, his sense of self, his strength, his courage, and his ability to look forward instead of back. And I wish I could have a conversation with him, because I think he would tell us to not forget the past and to not ignore it, but to move toward the future that we want. I was very eager to try to get into what she might have taught him or shared with him or told him, and then at the same time, the parents, the McKees were raising this, delicate young woman to be a good Southern woman and influencing her in a particular way. And Robert Barnwell Rhett was influencing his children in a very different, very particular way. And so I wanted to kind of get to the core of what makes people pursue what they perceive as their values, and what lengths will they go to achieve those things. And then, so circling back around to Robert Smalls, his great value was freedom for himself and his family. And he was willing to risk everything. I mean, literally everything for that. And not only his own life, but the lives of the people that he most loved, the lives of his crewmates. And I think about what would I risk my life for? And I can think of a few things, but then to risk the lives of people that I loved, how deep is that desire and that conviction that you would take that kind of a risk? Getting into that way of thinking was a huge challenge.
I know you must have been going a little crazy, because you had so many extreme personalities.
Yes.
You had, the left, the right, in the middle, very confused. And you had this man who endured so many hardships and came out as such a positive influence to the people around him,
yes,
to the community at large. And he was one of the lucky ones in a lot of ways. He was able to do that. I don't think I'd be able to risk the lives of my friends and family that way.
Isn't that just so hard to imagine? And, and again, if I could just have a conversation with him, maybe he had really high confidence that he could pull off that escape. Well, he did. So maybe he just knew it would happen. But I also think that the situation was so horrendous. As he said in the book, we'd rather die than live like this. And that too is really, I think, for most of us, impossible to imagine something so difficult that's a better option.
Yeah. But the way that you can draw emotion out of the reader, superb. Absolutely.
Oh, good. Thank you. There were a couple of really difficult parts, apart from the escape, of course. The McKee's little boy really did die very young, and then Small's little son died very young. And, all of my training is about bringing comfort and bringing peace. And then I had to write those scenes that are so discomforting and so heartbreaking and so much loss. that was a horrible challenge. And to write scenes of cruelty, even conversations around those things, even reading that in other novels is so uncomfortable and so upsetting. And yet those things are part of the story. And I really believe that sometimes history, our telling of history, makes the mistake of sanitizing the story, cleaning it up, sort of averting our eyes from the worst of it. And it's critical that we don't do that. We must acknowledge the worst of our stories.
You definitely did that. Yeah. I'm thinking about the end and I want to cry. But I enjoyed reading it. I think I read it in a day and a half.
Oh,
one day.
That's exciting to hear. That's great.
Well, I couldn't put it down. I wanted to make sure it was safe and that they all made it out. And there's so many things that kept rushing you to find out what happens next.
Right. Well, we wouldn't have a story to tell had he not made it. But I also think we wouldn't have sort of this larger than life legacy that continues to be a lesson. And my real prayer and my hope is that people honor his story and learn from it, and that we move forward in a way that honors what he gave himself to.
Yeah. Hopefully they do.
I hope so.
We can just keep working towards it every day, trying to be better people.
Right. Exactly.
And doing the right thing. That's always important.
Right. And for the right reasons, and not allowing ourselves to be distracted by all the noise around us. I think we have to pay attention to all the craziness and all the anxiety, and at the same time, focus most clearly on what we're called toward and who we actually can be, both, as individuals and as a people. We have a long way to go.
Well, definitely. But this is the perfect book to read for the times now. Thank you so much for sharing so much about how you achieved this story. And it's an award-winning book from the Feather Quill. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Until next time, keep asking questions. And if you want a fantastic historical novel to read, Trouble the Water. We'll see you soon.